Section 1. The show that couldn't stop starting fires. There is a very particular kind of television show that does not simply push boundaries. It does not test them carefully, peek over them with measured caution, or stand at the edge and politely wait for permission to proceed. This kind of show loads a cannon with every joke someone told you was off limits, aims it directly at the wall, and fires it again and again for 25 years, until the wall is rubble and the neighbors are calling for reinforcements, and the local newspaper has run 3 separate front-page stories about the noise. Family Guy is that show, the animated comedy that premiered on the 31st of January 1999, right after Super Bowl 33, when approximately 22 million people were still seated on their living room couches with plates of food balanced on their knees, went on to become one of the most debated, most complained about, most sued over, most banned, most written about pieces of television in the history of the medium. Not because of what it did to the Nielsen ratings, though the ratings tell their own strange and dramatic story. Not because of who created it, or who voiced its characters, or what network was brave or reckless enough to air it, though all of those details matter enormously. The reason Family Guy became the kind of show people still argue about with genuine passion decades after it first appeared on television is because it made a decision, apparently in the room during the very earliest pitch meetings, to go places other shows wouldn't, and it never, across all the seasons and all the episodes and all the years of its existence, made a serious attempt to stop making that decision. Seth MacFarlane, the person responsible for all of it, was 24 years old when he pitched the pilot to Fox. He was young in the way that people who are about to do something that will define the rest of their lives are young, which is to say, confident in ways that might have looked reckless from the outside and probably felt like clarity from the inside. He had studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, Rhode Island, which is a genuinely serious fine arts institution with a history of producing people who care deeply about craft. He had worked briefly in the writing rooms of children's cartoon shows, including work on Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory over at the Hanna-Barbera Animation Studios. And while he was still in school and just after graduating, he had made 2 short animated films about a man named Larry and his dog named Steve, which were funny and loose and showed a specific comedic sensibility that was already fully formed. He took Larry and turned him into Peter Griffin. He took Steve and turned him into Brian Griffin. He built a family around them, added a wife, a daughter, a son, and a baby who would go on to become one of the most original characters in the history of animated television, and he pitched the result to Fox in May of 1998. Fox liked it enough to give him the green light. The show premiered to that enormous Super Bowl audience in January 1999, and whatever any individual viewer thought of what they were watching that night, the response collectively was powerful enough to establish that there was an audience for this, and the audience was large. The show was set in a fictional Rhode Island town, and it followed the Griffin family with a kind of energy that was simultaneously familiar and completely new. The format was the American family sitcom, which had been around since the dawn of television, with all its expected components. The bumbling but lovable father. The more capable wife trying to keep everything together. The kids at various stages of navigating adolescence and childhood. The neighborhood that served as a supporting cast. But underneath those familiar structures was something genuinely different. A sense of humor that operated on multiple registers at once, that could be silly and dark and satirical and absurd in the same 30-second stretch, that used the conventions of the family sitcom format as a platform for commentary about those very conventions. The first 3 seasons of the show were, by any serious assessment, genuinely good television. Not just good animated television. Good television in an absolute sense. The writing was sharp. The characters had internal consistency and emotional logic. The jokes were constructed rather than merely produced. And underneath all of it was a warmth about the Griffin family that prevented the darkness from curdling into something merely unpleasant. The controversies that attended those early seasons were real but relatively contained. The show was on the Parents Television Council's radar from the beginning. The FCC received complaints, various groups objected to various moments. But the primary institutional controversy of the first 3 seasons was not about content, it was about scheduling. Fox kept moving the show around, never giving the audience the stable home it needed to build the kind of weekly viewing habit that keeps a show alive in the network television era. By 2002, the show was canceled, the writing staff dispersed, the lights went out, and then something happened that nobody predicted. Cartoon Network picked up the reruns for their Adult Swim late-night programming block, paying almost nothing for the rights because nobody thought there was much value in a canceled cartoon. The reruns began airing in April of 2003, and the audience that found them loved what they found. Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block, boosting viewership by something close to 239%. The DVD sets for the first 2 seasons sold more than 400,000 copies. The internet was buzzing with clips and discussions and fan communities. Fox noticed. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice made the decision to order new episodes. A 4th season was announced for 2005. Fans who had given up on the show were thrilled. The revival was celebrated as one of the most improbable second chances in television history. But the show that came back was not precisely the show that had left. The 3 years away had scattered the writing staff. New writers came in with different sensibilities. The tone shifted. The cutaway gags that had been a clever structural element of the early show began to multiply and expand. The characters started to drift. And the controversies, which had been significant but manageable in the first 3 seasons, began to accelerate in ways that would eventually make Family Guy the single most complained about animated comedy in the history of American television. That acceleration is what we are going to trace tonight. Every major controversy, every pulled episode, every federal complaint, every lawsuit, every political firestorm, every moment where a fictional family in a fictional Rhode Island town managed to make the actual world react as though something real had been threatened. Let's begin. Before we dive in, it is worth pausing to consider the specific texture of what we are examining when we look at Family Guy's controversies. This is not a simple story about a show that was bad and people correctly complained about it. The controversies around Family Guy are more interesting than that. They are the record of a show that was genuinely and often brilliantly transgressive in its early years, that understood something real about the power of comedy to expose uncomfortable truths, and that over time found itself in a complicated relationship with its own transgressive identity, sometimes using it purposefully and sometimes hiding behind it when the creative well ran dry. The controversies are not just incidents. They are a map of the show's creative trajectory, charting when it was doing something meaningful with its provocations, and when it was simply being provocative, because that was the identity it had established and it didn't know how to be anything else. That map is what we are going to trace tonight. From the very first FCC complaint to the most recent renewal deal, from the lawsuit filed in a California federal courthouse to the government ban in a South American country, from the episode that made 188,000 people write letters to the federal government to the one that made 25,000 people sign a petition about a fictional dog. Before we go any further, drop something in the comments. Tell us where you are watching this from and what time it is. There is something genuinely moving about knowing this video is accompanying people through evenings and early mornings all over the world, and hearing from you is one of the best parts of doing this. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider it. It is free, it helps the channel considerably, and there is a great deal more material like this in the pipeline. Section 2. Before the controversies, there was almost nothing. The cancellation story. To properly understand why the controversies around Family Guy carry the weight they do, you have to start with the fact that for most of its history, Family Guy has not been a comfortable or secure institution. It has not been the kind of show that occupies an unthreatened position in the television landscape, drawing consistent audiences and generating stable revenue, and weathering minor controversies from a position of power. For enormous stretches of its existence, Family Guy has been a show on the edge, a show that survived things that should have killed it, a show whose continued existence was, at multiple points, genuinely surprising. Understanding that precariousness changes how you read everything that came after it. The show's willingness to court controversy, its refusal to moderate its content in response to complaints, its tendency to push harder rather than pulling back when it generated backlash, all of these qualities make more sense when you understand that the show had already been canceled twice and come back once from a position that should have been permanent death. When you have survived things that were supposed to end you, your relationship to risk changes. The normal calculations don't apply in the same way. The original run of Family Guy lasted 3 seasons, from January 1999 to May 2002. During that time, the show's average viewership was solid, ranking it at number 33 in the overall Nielsen ratings during its first season, with around 12.8 million households tuning in. For a new animated comedy being developed at Fox, These were respectable numbers. The show had found an audience. There was every reason to believe it could grow that audience over subsequent seasons. But Fox made a series of decisions that systematically undermined the show's ability to maintain or grow that base. During the second season, the network placed Family Guy on Thursday nights at 9 p.m., which put it in direct competition with Frasier on NBC. Frasier was one of the most critically beloved comedies on American television at the time, consistently performing well in ratings and attracting an audience that was both large and demographically desirable to advertisers. Family Guy was not equipped to beat it. The numbers fell. Fox then moved the show to Tuesday nights, where it faced competition from Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. The game show phenomenon was, at the turn of the millennium, the kind of program that cleared living rooms and stopped conversations. It was appointment television of a kind that doesn't really exist anymore, the shared cultural moment that millions of people participated in simultaneously. Family Guy couldn't compete with that either. The ratings dropped further. The network kept moving the show from slot to slot without giving the audience enough warning or enough time to find it and build the viewing habit that keeps a show alive. By the end of the third season in May of 2002, Fox made the decision to cancel Family Guy. The show's fourth series of episodes, which had been partially written and produced, was scrapped. The writing staff dispersed. The voices went back to other work. The Griffin family, in a practical sense, ceased to exist. What happened over the next 3 years is one of the stranger stories in American entertainment. Cartoon Network had purchased the syndication rights to Family Guy reruns for the Adult Swim programming block they were building. Adult Swim was a nighttime animation programming strategy aimed at adult audiences, distinct from the children's programming Cartoon Network ran during the day. The block was still finding its identity in the early 2000s, experimenting with different kinds of content to figure out what worked for the late-night audience it was trying to reach. Family Guy was not expected to be a major piece of that puzzle. Cartoon Network had paid very little for the rights because nobody, including the executives making the deal, thought a canceled cartoon from Fox was worth very much. The reruns began airing on the 20th of April 2003. The response was extraordinary and almost immediate. Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block. Its numbers were not just good relative to what the block had been doing. They were dramatically, unusually, historically good. The show boosted Adult Swim's overall viewership by approximately 239%. It pulled in audiences that had never watched Adult Swim before and created viewing habits around the block that extended beyond the Family Guy time slot. At the same time, something was happening in the marketplace that amplified the signal even further. Fox released the DVD sets for the show's first and second seasons, and they sold more than 400,000 copies. This was a significant number for any home video release, but for a canceled cartoon from a major network with no new content in the pipeline, it was remarkable. People were not just watching the reruns on cable. They were spending money to own the show permanently. They were rewatching episodes they'd already seen. They were building a relationship with a television show that had been taken off the air 2 years earlier. And they were talking about it online. The early 2000s internet was not the internet of today, but fan forums and message boards existed, and the Family Guy conversation happening across them was enthusiastic and sustained and growing. The show was developing a cult following in the most literal sense of that phrase, a group of devoted viewers who had organized their interest into something that looked less like passive television watching and more like active community participation. Fox noticed all of this because networks are very good at noticing things that involve millions of people doing something around their content. The mathematics were difficult to ignore. The Adult Swim numbers were public. The DVD sales figures were available. The online conversation was visible even to executives who didn't participate in it. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice found itself looking at a show that had, during the years it wasn't on the air, grown into something larger than it had been when they canceled it. In 2004, Fox made the decision to order new episodes. A fourth season was set to air in 2005. The announcement generated genuine excitement in the fan community and considerable media coverage. The revival was treated, accurately, as something genuinely unusual in the television business. Shows don't come back from cancellation the way Family Guy did. Not after 2 cancellations. Not after 3 years off the air. The fourth season premiered on the 1st of May 2005 on Fox's Sunday night animation lineup alongside The Simpsons and King of the Hill, and its ratings justified every decision that had led to its return. Audiences showed up. The fan base that had built itself during the hiatus proved to be real and loyal and large enough to matter. But the controversies that had been relatively contained in the first 3 seasons began to expand after the revival, and they would keep expanding, season by season, until Family Guy occupied a position in the American cultural conversation that was genuinely unique. The most complained about, most sued over, most internationally controversial animated program in the history of American broadcast television. Section 3. The Parents Television Council and the Federal Government. A 2-decade war. There is an organization called the Parents Television Council, and for the better part of 2 decades, it devoted considerable institutional resources to the project of making Family Guy's existence more difficult. Not through the kinds of direct pressure that advertisers can apply to networks, though it tried that too. Primarily through the mechanism of formal complaint, specifically by filing objections with the Federal Communications Commission about episodes and scenes it found indecent, and by organizing its membership base, which it claimed at various points numbered around 1.3 million people, to file their own complaints alongside the organization's official ones. The PTC was founded in 1995 by L. Brent Bozell III, a conservative media activist who had built his career in the business of monitoring what he considered the degradation of American culture through entertainment. The organization's stated purpose was to promote responsibility in the entertainment industry, which in practice meant documenting content it found objectionable and amplifying objections through media campaigns and government complaint processes. The PTC published a weekly designation called Worst TV Show of the Week, and over the history of Family Guy's run, it gave that designation to Family Guy more than 40 separate times. No other single program has appeared on that list as frequently. The relationship between Family Guy and the PTC was openly hostile on both sides, and the hostility was explicit in ways that made the feud itself something of a recurring subplot in the story of the show. McFarlane was asked about the organization in interviews on multiple occasions, and his responses were unambiguous. He described the group's leadership in terms that compared receiving their criticism to getting hostile mail from Hitler, which left very little room for nuance. He noted, as someone who identified as an atheist, that he found something particularly galling about an organization that promoted Christian values while operating, in his view, with a kind of cruelty and dishonesty that contradicted those values in fundamental ways. He described reading their newsletter and visiting their website as revealing something rotten at their core. The PTC was unmoved by this response and continued filing complaints. The dynamic that resulted was something like a long-running public argument in which both parties understood they were not going to change each other's positions, but found value in making the argument anyway. For the PTC, every Family Guy controversy was a fundraising opportunity and a demonstration to its membership that the organization was doing the work it had promised to do. For Family Guy, the PTC's hostility was a signal to the audience. The show was actually trying to reach that this was the kind of program that the kind of people who formed organizations called the Parents Television Council found threatening, which made it more appealing to everyone who didn't want to be the kind of person who found it threatening. The episode that generated the most quantifiable controversy in terms of formal government complaints was a Season 7 episode called Family Gay, which aired on the 8th of March 2009. The episode's plot began with Peter Griffin deciding, while at the store to buy groceries, to instead spend his money on a horse that turned out to have brain damage. The horse went on a destructive rampage, caused significant property damage, and ultimately died of a heart attack during a race. The Griffins were left in considerable financial debt. To earn money, Peter agreed to participate in a series of medical experiments at a local research facility, where he was injected with various gene sequences to test their effects on human behavior. The experiments included a sequence where Peter received what the episode called the gay gene, which caused him to become homosexual. He fell in love with another man, left Lois, and moved into a different domestic situation. The episode then followed the family's attempt to understand and respond to this development, and eventually included a subplot set in a conversion therapy camp where gay men were being encouraged to become straight. The camp involved a counselor distributing baseball bats and instructing the participants on how to use them, with the punchline of the scene depending on the counselor's increasingly alarmed instructions about what not to do with those bats, implying that the campers were using them in ways entirely at odds with the camp's stated therapeutic mission. The episode also included a scene where baby Stewie sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast cereal, And Peter explained to the family that some of the milk in the refrigerator was actually horse sperm that had been accidentally stored alongside the regular milk, because Peter had been briefly attempting to make money as a horse breeder. Stewie, characteristically, continued eating his cereal without apparent concern or interest in the distinction. The Parents Television Council filed a formal complaint about the episode with the FCC, and then sent communications to its membership base urging every member to file their own individual complaints. The result was 188,368 formal complaints submitted to the FCC about a single episode of an animated sitcom. This number is remarkable in multiple ways. It represents an organizational achievement of a particular kind, the successful mobilization of more than 188,000 individual people to take a specific civic action in response to a television episode. It also represents the specific content that mobilized them. Not depictions of violence, not hateful speech targeting a protected class, but a gay sex subplot in a comedy cartoon and a baby accidentally eating breakfast cereal prepared with horse semen. The FCC reviewed the complaints and the episode and declined to take any enforcement action. The agency found that the content, while graphic and certainly explicit by the standards of primetime network animation, did not meet the legal threshold for broadcast indecency in a way that would require the commission to act. The legal standard requires content to be patently offensive according to contemporary community standards for the broadcast medium, and to involve explicit descriptions or depictions of sexual or excretory activities in a graphic, shocking, and pandering manner. The FCC determined that Family Guy did not meet these criteria, notwithstanding the circumstances of Stewie's breakfast. Family Guy continued to air. The episode remained available in reruns and on streaming platforms. The PTC filed its next complaint about a different episode. This cycle repeated itself throughout the show's history, and it created something genuinely interesting in terms of the show's cultural position. The PTC's repeated attacks on Family Guy served, paradoxically, to amplify the show's rebellious identity. Every time the council named Family Guy as its worst show of the week, it was essentially running an advertisement for exactly the kind of audience Family Guy was trying to reach. Young viewers who were actively uninterested in being told what they could or couldn't watch found a certain pleasure in the idea that this cartoon was making such an earnest organization so consistently furious. The show leaned into this dynamic rather than pulling back from it. In a Season 4 episode called PTV, Peter Griffin responded to the FCC cracking down on television content by starting his own uncensored cable channel broadcast from his house. The episode was an explicit satirical response to the PTC and the FCC, featuring a song about censorship, running jokes about the absurdity of regulating real life for decency, and a direct parody of the argument that watchdog organizations like the PTC were advancing. The PTC, in a development that was genuinely funny to everyone who was not a member of the PTC, considered filing a complaint about the episode that mocked them for filing complaints. They ultimately chose not to, but the fact that the internal discussion happened was a demonstration of exactly the kind of institutional self-awareness deficit that the episode was satirizing. Throughout the entire two-decade campaign of the PTC against Family Guy, the score remained consistent. The PTC filed complaints, the FCC denied them, Family Guy aired. The next week, another complaint. The cycle never produced anything that fundamentally changed the show's content or broadcast status, but it provided a consistent backdrop of formal, institutional opposition against which the show's transgressions were measured. And in that sense, the PTC may have been valuable to the show's identity in ways the organization never intended. Being the show that the Parents Television Council hated most meant something to the audience Family Guy was trying to reach. Section 4. Carol Burnett, Parody Law and a Federal Courthouse. On the 15th of March, 2007, one of the most genuinely beloved entertainers in the history of American television hired lawyers and walked into a California federal courthouse to file a lawsuit against 20th Century Fox for more than $2 million. Her name was Carol Burnett. She was 73 years old. She had spent decades as one of the most warmly regarded comic performers on the planet, the host of a sketch variety program that ran from 1967 to 1978, and produced comedy that endured in the cultural memory long after its initial broadcast. And she was absolutely serious about this lawsuit. The event that prompted the suit was an 18-second sequence in a Family Guy episode called Peterotica, which aired in April of 2006. Peter Griffin visits a local adult entertainment shop. One of his companions notes that the shop appears unusually clean. Peter asks why. He is told it is because Carol Burnett works there part-time as a janitor. The camera cuts to an animated version of Burnett's famous character, the Charwoman, a cleaning lady she had developed and performed throughout the Carol Burnett show, one of the character's defining creations. The Charwoman appears in the adult shop, wearing what the lawsuit would specifically describe as her trademarked blue bonnet, carrying her bucket and her mop. Running underneath the scene is a slightly altered version of the musical theme from The Carol Burnett Show, the melody Carol Burnett herself sang at the end of every episode for 11 years. The scene continued. Characters referred to Burnett's signature gesture, the ear tug she performed during every episode of her variety show, as a personal greeting to her grandmother. A character in the Family Guy scene commented on the gesture and made a crude joke suggesting the ear tug had a different sexual significance when directed toward her father rather than her grandmother. The sequence ended after approximately 18 seconds and the episode moved on. Burnett's complaint alleged multiple causes of action. Copyright infringement was the primary claim. The suit argued that Family Guy had used her trademarked Charwoman character, her trademarked musical theme, and her signature physical gesture without obtaining permission, and in a context that violated her copyright in those creative properties. The suit also alleged violation of her right of publicity, a legal doctrine that protects individuals from unauthorized commercial use of their name and likeness. At various points, the lawsuit asked for more than $6 million in damages. Fox's response was swift and strategically pointed. A studio spokesman noted publicly that Family Guy, like The Carol Burnett Show, was famous for its pop culture parodies and satirical jabs at celebrities, and expressed apparent surprise that a performer who had built her career on exactly that kind of comedy would pursue legal action over a brief satirical reference to her work. The implicit argument was that Burnett was not in a position to claim special protection from parody, given the tradition of satire that her own show had represented and perpetuated throughout its long run on television. The case went before United States District Judge Dean Pregerson in June of 2007. His ruling dismissed Burnett's lawsuit entirely, and his written opinion contained observations that went beyond the mechanical application of the relevant law. The judge acknowledged directly that there was a substantial difference in creative quality between what Carol Burnett had done in creating the Charwoman character and what the Family Guy writers had done in repurposing that character for a dirty joke in an adult shop. Burnett's original work was richer and more inventive than the parody. The judge was explicit about this. But the question before him was not which piece of work was better. The question was whether the parody was legally protected under the First Amendment and under the applicable parody doctrine, and the answer was yes. Public figures, the judge wrote, are frequent targets of parody and crude innuendo in the current media environment. The modern landscape of television and internet content had essentially eliminated any self-imposed restraint from the use of famous people and their work as comic material. This was not an endorsement of that state of affairs. It was an accurate description of it. And the legal framework governing parody provided Family Guy with the protection it needed to survive the lawsuit. Burnett received no money. The episode was not edited or altered. No restriction was placed on future airings of the sequence, or on Family Guy's ability to use similar material involving other public figures in the future. The Burnett case mattered beyond its immediate outcome. It served as a test case for how broadly animated comedy could reach into the cultural landscape, pull out recognizable figures and their creative properties, and use them for satirical purposes without crossing into legal liability. The answer, as articulated by Judge Pregerson, was very broadly indeed. The First Amendment protected parody with considerable force, and the bar for what could be done with a public figure's identity in a comedic context was set at a level that gave shows like Family Guy extraordinary creative latitude. The Bourne Company music publishers lawsuit, which followed the Burnett case by just a few months in October 2007, tested a different dimension of the same question. The Bourne Company held the rights to the classic Disney song When You Wish Upon a Star, written for the 1940 film Pinocchio. The company filed suit against Fox, alleging copyright infringement based on a Family Guy episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which featured a song Peter Griffin sang called I Need a Jew. The song borrowed the melody and overall structure of When You Wish Upon a Star and applied it to Peter's ignorant but enthusiastic conviction that Jewish people were universally skilled at managing money. Fox defended on parody grounds, arguing that the transformation of the original song into the Griffin family's comedic equivalent was precisely the kind of transformative use that parody doctrine protects. The original song's melody was famous enough that the audience would immediately recognize the connection between the original and the parody, and that recognition was the mechanism by which the joke worked. The court agreed with Fox in 2009. The lawsuit was dismissed. Family Guy had now successfully defended 2 separate copyright actions within a roughly 2-year period, and the cumulative effect of these legal victories was to establish a very clear operational understanding within the show's production about where the lines were and how much room they had to work in. The lines were far out, the room was very large, and the show used it. Section 5. The episode that never aired in America. The most extreme act of censorship in Family Guy's history did not involve a government agency. It did not involve a court ruling or a regulatory finding or a formal ban of the kind that governments sometimes impose on speech they find dangerous. It was a decision made by a network, quietly, internally, about an episode that had already been produced, had already been completed through every stage of the production process, and was ready for broadcast. The network decided not to air it. Then it asked other networks not to air it either. And the episode, which is called Partial Terms of Endearment, has never been broadcast in the United States. Not once. The episode was produced for the show's 8th season. The story begins when an old college friend of Lois Griffin reaches out after many years of no contact to ask if Lois would be willing to serve as a surrogate mother for her and her husband. The couple desperately wants a child and cannot have one biologically. Lois, after some deliberation, agrees. The pregnancy begins. Then, the couple is killed in a car accident, leaving the pregnancy in an extraordinary and painful situation. The biological child of people who are now dead, being carried by a surrogate who has her own family, her own life, and her own deeply complicated feelings about what has happened. The episode then spends its remaining time on the question of what Lois should do. Continue the pregnancy and carry the baby to term, then determine what happens to a child whose intended parents are gone. Or end the pregnancy? The episode presents both positions through the voices of various characters, including Peter, who is characteristically unable to engage with the complexity of the situation in any meaningful way, and Lois, who is forced to sit with the weight of an impossible choice that nobody should have to make alone. The show approached this material with substantially more seriousness than its usual treatment of sensitive topics. It did not use the abortion question as a punchline. It did not collapse the complexity of the issue into a simple comedic position or arrive at a convenient resolution through a third-act joke. It was, for Family Guy, an unusually restrained and emotionally engaged piece of writing about a topic that American culture finds genuinely difficult to discuss without immediately dividing into hostile camps. Fox decided not to air it. Seth MacFarlane described the network's position publicly in terms that framed the decision as a content call. The episode was, in his words, too edgy for Fox. Fox Entertainment president Kevin Riley was more specific in his public comments, describing abortion as an extremely fragile subject matter and noting that the economic circumstances of the time added to the network's reluctance to broadcast content that would predictably generate organized boycott campaigns and advertiser pressure from a significant portion of the viewing population. The economic argument was honest, which makes it a useful window into how these decisions actually get made in the broadcast television business. Networks are advertising-supported enterprises, and content that divides the audience sharply along deeply held value lines creates specific financial risks that content which merely offends a minority of viewers does not. An episode that made fun of organized religion, for instance, would generate complaints from religious viewers, but would not typically organize the kind of sustained, targeted advertiser boycott that abortion content reliably produces in the American media environment. Partial Terms of Endearment was not rejected because its content was gratuitously offensive in the way that most Family Guy controversies were offensive. It was rejected because its content was genuinely controversial in a way that threatened a specific and quantifiable kind of economic harm. Fox went further than simply declining to broadcast the episode on their own network. The company also contacted Adult Swim and requested that the cable network not air the episode either. This was an unusual step, one that indicated a level of institutional caution that went beyond normal network reluctance to broadcast difficult content. Fox was actively working to prevent the episode from reaching American viewers through any platform the company had any relationship with or influence over. The episode eventually found an audience through other means. BBC Three aired it in the United Kingdom on the 20th of June 2010, treating it as a regular season 8 episode for British viewers. It was included on the DVD release of the 8th season in certain regions, meaning viewers who bought the physical discs could watch it at home. And when streaming services eventually began carrying Family Guy's back catalog, the episode became available through some of them for viewers outside the United States. But it has never aired on American television. Not during its original broadcast window. Not in reruns. Not in syndication. Not on any cable network or streaming service that operates within the network of agreements that governs the show's domestic distribution. More than 15 years after it was produced, Partial Terms of Endearment remains the only episode in the show's history to have been completely and permanently withheld from American audiences by its own network. The paradox at the heart of this controversy is worth dwelling on. Family Guy spent years being celebrated and attacked for its willingness to approach sensitive topics without flinching, to drag uncomfortable subjects into the comedic arena and subject them to irreverence that made people uncomfortable. The show made jokes about religion, race, disability, sexuality, death, terrorism, and virtually every other subject that American culture treats with special care. Most of those episodes aired. The one episode that was permanently banned was the one that tried to be serious rather than flip about a sensitive topic, that attempted genuine emotional engagement with a genuinely difficult question rather than reaching for the easy joke. The network was not afraid of Family Guy being offensive about abortion. It was afraid of Family Guy being thoughtful about it, and that specific fear says something precise and slightly unsettling about the relationship between broadcast television and the most contested questions in American public life. Section 6. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein and 3 Years on a Shelf. Partial Terms of Endearment was not the only episode to spend significant time unseen before reaching its audience. An episode from the show's 3rd season sat in Fox's drawer for nearly 3 years, and its journey from completion to broadcast tells a story about the specific kinds of cultural anxiety that comedy has historically generated around sensitive subjects. The episode is called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and it was originally produced during the show's 2nd season, intended for broadcast in December of 2000. The story follows Peter Griffin, who has made a mess of the family's finances through a series of his characteristic poor decisions, and who concludes, through a reasoning process that is a near-perfect distillation of his limited intellectual capacity, that what he needs is a Jewish person to help him fix the problem. Peter's logic is rooted in an ethnic stereotype. He believes, sincerely and without any awareness that this belief is offensive, that Jewish people are universally skilled at managing money and that acquiring a Jewish accountant will solve all his financial difficulties. Through a series of coincidences, Peter befriends a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, and the episode follows his enthusiastic but catastrophically misguided exploration of Judaism, which eventually leads him to try to have his son Chris bar mitzvahed without anyone else's knowledge or consent. Peter reasons, with his customary complete disconnection from how human beings or religious institutions actually work, that if Chris becomes Jewish, he will automatically develop the financial acumen that Peter has decided is an ethnic trait. Lois, as usual, serves as the voice of basic sanity, arguing that Chris's success in life will depend on his own efforts and choices, rather than his religious affiliation. The episode resolves with Peter learning, in the most general possible terms, that success is not determined by ethnic background. Peter's conversion of his worldview from ignorance to slightly less ignorance was intended, by the writers, to be the satirical engine of the episode. The joke was about Peter, not about Jewish people. The episode was making fun of ethnic stereotyping and the particular kind of willful ignorance that produces it, using Peter's sincere but absurd belief in the money stereotype as a way to expose how such stereotypes work and why they are wrong. The fact that approximately 70% of the show's writing staff was Jewish at the time of production, and that the episode was specifically written by a Jewish writer named Ricky Blitt, was relevant context. Seth MacFarlane showed the script to 2 rabbis before it went into production. Both of them approved it on the grounds that Peter ultimately learned the right lesson. Fox's executives decided not to air it anyway. The concern was that viewers who did not engage carefully with the satire, who did not understand that the episode was mocking Peter's stereotyping rather than endorsing it, might experience the episode as anti-Semitic. This is a genuine and real interpretive risk, with satire as a comedic mode. The mechanism only works if the audience understands that the satirical target is the belief being depicted, not the group being stereotyped. When that understanding breaks down, or when there is genuine reason to believe the audience may not bring it to the viewing experience, satire becomes one of the riskiest things a piece of popular entertainment can attempt. Fox's anxiety about this produced a decision that seems peculiar in retrospect. They suppressed an episode specifically designed to mock anti-Semitic stereotyping out of fear that some viewers might mistake it for anti-Semitic content. The protection against the accusation became, itself, the decision that made the episode a cause célèbre. The episode sat unreleased through the rest of 2000, through the first cancellation of the show in 2001, through the Adult Swim rerun era, and finally aired on Adult Swim in November 2003, nearly 3 years after it was produced. Fox broadcast a censored version in December 2004, altering one specific lyric in the episode's central song. The original version of the song included the line, "Even though they killed my lord," which was Peter's confused and self-contradicting expression of his relationship with Jewish people alongside his residual, blood libel beliefs. Fox changed the line to, "I don't think they killed my lord," which removed the darkest dimension of the joke but made the network comfortable enough to air the episode. The song, called "I Need a Jew," was set to the melody of "When You Wish Upon a Star," the classic Disney standard, and it was this musical borrowing that generated the subsequent Bourne Company lawsuit. But the episode itself, even before the lawsuit, had already demonstrated something important. That the same network that would eventually air episodes generating nearly 200,000 FCC complaints drew the line at airing an episode that satirized ethnic stereotyping, for fear of the satire being mistaken for the thing it was criticizing. Both of these facts, the episodes that aired and the episode that didn't, are revealing about the specific contours of the show's relationship with its network. Section 7. Turban Cowboy and the Boston Marathon. In the history of Family Guy controversies, most of them follow a predictable sequence. The show made a joke, a group found it offensive, a public argument happened, and eventually the argument moved on. The creative choice came before the controversy it generated, always. The timeline was clear. Someone wrote something, then people reacted to it. Turban Cowboy broke this pattern in a way that made it qualitatively different from almost everything else in the show's history. And that difference is what makes it worth examining carefully. Turban Cowboy aired on Fox on the 17th of March 2013. It was the 15th episode of the show's 11th season. In the episode, Peter Griffin goes skydiving and ends up in the hospital after a difficult landing. While recovering, he befriends a man named Mahmoud and, through this friendship, develops an enthusiastic interest in Islam. The main plot involves Peter's conversion experience and his friend's growing suspicion that Mahmoud may have connections to a terrorist cell. The episode contained two pieces of content that would become deeply problematic within a matter of weeks. The first was a cutaway gag, inserted as a side joke during a scene involving Peter discussing the Boston Marathon. The cutaway depicted Peter Griffin driving a car through the crowd of marathon runners, leaving a trail of injured and incapacitated people behind him. The joke was that this was how Peter won the race, not by running it but by driving through the field of competitors and eliminating them through vehicular assault. It was dark, it was characteristically violent in the cartoonish way that Family Guy's physical comedy typically operated, and it was essentially disconnected from the main plot of the episode. The second piece of problematic content was in the episode's ending, where Peter accidentally detonated explosions by dialing a cell phone that happened to be connected to a terrorist's detonation circuit. The bomb by phone sequence was presented as comedic, with Peter unintentionally triggering the explosions in a sequence designed to be absurdist and over the top. On the 15th of April, 2013, 29 days after Turban Cowboy aired, 2 pressure cooker bombs detonated near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed. Hundreds more were injured. 17 of those injured lost limbs. It was one of the most devastating domestic terrorist attacks on American soil since the 11th of September 2001. Within hours of the bombing, someone had taken scenes from Turban Cowboy and edited them together in a deliberately misleading way, designed to suggest the episode had somehow depicted the Boston Marathon bombing in advance. The edited clip placed the car through the crowd sequence directly next to footage of the episode's explosion sequence, removing the context that separated these moments in the actual episode and manufacturing the impression that Family Guy had shown a bomb attack at the Boston Marathon. The clip was not accurate. The explosion in the episode involved a bridge, not the marathon. The editing was a hoax, but the clip spread virally, and for a period of hours it genuinely confused people about what the episode had contained. Seth MacFarlane responded publicly and with unusual directness. He described the edited clip as abhorrent. He expressed his condolences for the victims of the actual attack. He clarified that the clip was manufactured from scenes that did not appear together or in the sequence the edit implied, and that Family Guy had not depicted anything like what the edited clip suggested. Fox pulled the episode from every platform it controlled. Fox.com removed it. Hulu removed it. Amazon removed it. The network announced it had no current plans to re-air the episode. The response was immediate and total. The Turban Cowboy situation was different from most Family Guy controversies for a specific reason. There was no viable argument for the show's creative choices here. The Boston Marathon cutaway gag had been dark before the attack. It had not been particularly clever or pointed as satire. It depicted mass casualties at a real, named event as the punchline of a quick scene about how Peter Griffin won a race he clearly didn't run. Even before April 15th, it was the kind of content that could be criticized without being accused of humorlessness. After April 15th, the argument for it had completely collapsed. MacFarlane's personal proximity to September 11th added another layer to the resonance of this specific moment. He had been booked on American Airlines Flight 11 on the morning of the 11th of September 2001, returning to Los Angeles from Boston after a college speaking engagement. His travel agent had given him a slightly incorrect departure time, and the night before he had been out and was, by his own admission, significantly hungover when he woke up the next morning. He arrived at Logan Airport approximately 10 minutes after the flight's departure time. The gate was closed. He had missed it. American Airlines Flight 1 was the first of the 4 hijacked planes that morning. At 8:46 a.m., it struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Everyone aboard was killed. MacFarlane has described this publicly multiple times. He missed the plane by about 10 minutes because of a combination of bad information and the previous night's decisions. He described it as a very close call. The weight of that near miss, the specific knowledge of how differently that morning could have ended, marks him in ways that occasionally surface in discussions of the show's approach to terrorism as comedic material. The Turban Cowboy situation illustrated something essential about dark comedy's relationship with real-world tragedy. Jokes about terrible things exist in actual time, and actual time keeps moving, and the distance between a comedic treatment of something terrible and the actual terrible thing is never as fixed as the moment of writing assumes it to be. Family Guy made jokes from a position of safety. The real world occasionally reminded it that the safety was contingent. Section 8. The Death and Resurrection of Brian Griffin. On the 24th of November 2013, Family Guy killed its family dog. Brian Griffin, voiced by Seth MacFarlane since the show's very first episode in January of 1999, had been one of the 4 or 5 most central characters in the entire series for 14 years. He was the talking dog who drank martinis, drove a car, read books, failed repeatedly at finishing a novel he believed was great, harbored complicated feelings about Lois Griffin, and served across the first several seasons as the show's clearest voice of reason in a household defined by chaos. He was the character the show had used to ground itself when everything else was spinning out of control, and for much of the show's history, he was the character that the audience most readily identified with. The episode called Life of Brian opened without any particular indication of what was coming. The main story involved Stewie and Brian's complicated relationship with the time machine, which Stewie ultimately dismantled to prevent further misuse. The dismantling of the time machine was important to the internal logic of what followed, because it meant that the mechanism the show had repeatedly used to undo consequences and reset storylines was no longer available. Without the time machine, things that happened would stay happened. Then Brian ran into the street to retrieve something during a street hockey game. A car that was moving at speed struck him directly. There was no punchline. The show did not cut away to a different joke. The Griffin family gathered around him. His injuries were serious. He was dying. His last words, as the episode depicted them, were that he loved them all. The Griffins mourned him in a way that Family Guy almost never depicted grief. Straightforwardly, without irony, with what appeared to be genuine emotional weight. By the end of the episode, the family had a new dog. His name was Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of Sopranos fame, and he was presented as the family's new companion going forward. The reaction from the audience was immediate, enormous, and overwhelmingly angry. The hashtag RIP Brian reached the top of Twitter's trending list within hours of the episode airing. Approximately 25,000 people signed a Change.org petition specifically demanding that the producers bring Brian back. National media organizations that did not normally cover animated sitcom plot developments ran stories about the death as a genuine news event. The coverage was extensive and sustained, generating a level of visibility for the show that a typical episode in its 13th season would not have generated on its own merits. Executive producer Steve Callahan, speaking in the lead-up to the episode, had described killing Brian as a fun way to shake things up. Seth MacFarlane acknowledged afterward that the production had expected a stir, but not the specific volume and intensity of fury they received. He described being surprised that people still cared enough about the character to be that angry. The line was revealing in ways MacFarlane probably didn't intend. It acknowledged that the creative team had been uncertain whether the audience still had sufficient emotional investment in Brian to react powerfully, which meant the death was designed precisely to test and exploit that investment rather than to serve the story. Then, on the 15th of December, 2013, in the season's Christmas episode titled Christmas Guy, Stewie encountered a version of himself from an earlier moment in the timeline who still had access to a time machine. He used it to travel back and push Brian out of the path of the car that had killed him. Brian survived. The timeline that had included his death was erased. Vinny appeared briefly in subsequent episodes, and then was largely written out of the show's ongoing present. Everything went back to normal. MacFarlane posted publicly after Christmas Guy aired. He wrote words to the effect that viewers hadn't really thought he would permanently kill off Brian, had they? He noted that Brian was overcome with gratitude for how much the fans had cared. The portion of the audience that felt they had been manipulated reacted to this with something between fury and genuine exhaustion. The argument from this camp was specific and defensible. The show had taken something that viewers genuinely cared about, had presented its destruction with unusual emotional seriousness, had allowed the grief to sit for 3 full weeks between episodes, had generated enormous press coverage on the basis of the apparent permanence of the change, and had then undone all of it in a way that confirmed the death was never intended to be meaningful. The emotional investment the audience brought to Brian's death had been used as fuel for a ratings exercise, and the resurrection made that use of trust visible and irrevocable. The counter-argument, offered by defenders of the creative decision, was that Family Guy had always been a show where anything could happen, that this was exactly the point MacFarlane claimed he was trying to make, and that the audience's willingness to believe Brian was really dead demonstrated that the show still had the capacity to create genuine surprise and feeling. The death and resurrection had proved that people still cared enough to be moved. Both of these things can be simultaneously true. The stunt worked as a demonstration of audience engagement. It was also, by the most straightforward understanding of what makes something a stunt. Neither truth cancels the other. What the Brian death controversy revealed about Family Guy's relationship with its audience in 2013 was something that had been building for several seasons. The show had begun treating viewer investment as a resource to be extracted, rather than a relationship to be honored. The emotional connections that long-term viewers had built with these characters over 14 years were real, and those connections made those viewers vulnerable to specific kinds of manipulation in ways that casual viewers were not. Using genuine emotional attachment as the mechanism of a promotional strategy, and then revealing that the attachment had been exploited rather than respected, is a particular kind of bad faith. It changed something about the relationship between the show and the people who watched it, and that change did not fully reverse itself when Brian came back on screen in December. Section 9. Meg Griffin and 10 Years of Cruelty. There are controversies that happen in single moments that can be pointed to as specific episodes or specific decisions that generated a specific public reaction. The controversy around the treatment of Meg Griffin was not a moment at all. It was a decade-long accumulation of choices, each one individually defensible as comedic excess, collectively amounting to something that critics, advocates, and eventually the show's own expanded writing staff came to recognize as genuinely harmful. Mila Kunis took over the voice of Meg from season 2 onward, after Lacey Chabert voiced the character in the first season. The character she inherited was, in those earliest episodes, a straightforward portrayal of teenage difficulty. Meg was Peter and Lois's oldest child, a student at James Woods Regional High School, unpopular among her peers, overlooked at home, not particularly interesting compared to the rest of her family's unusual composition. The comedy in the early seasons came from the contrast. Meg was the ordinary one in a household of extraordinary weirdness, and that contrast served a comedic function without requiring cruelty. The shift started gradually around season 4, the revival period. New writers brought changed sensibilities, and one of the changes that emerged was a gradual reorientation of the Meg jokes away from her being boring and toward her being ugly. This is a significant shift, and it is worth being specific about what makes it different. A joke about a character being boring allows the character to potentially change. A joke about a character's physical appearance is aimed at something the character has no control over, something that exists prior to any choice or action or personality trait. It is humor that takes a person's involuntary physical existence as its target, and it is crueler not just in degree but in kind. As the post-revival seasons progressed, the Meg jokes moved further in this direction. Other characters began responding to her presence with visible disgust. Peter started making actively cruel comments about his daughter's appearance and existence that went well beyond the inattentive but ultimately caring father of the early seasons. The jokes escalated in frequency and intensity. By the time the show reached its 8th and 9th seasons, Meg's mistreatment had become so normalized that it functioned as a kind of structural element of the show, a piece of its architecture that appeared in most episodes the way establishing shots appear in most scenes. The specific forms the mistreatment took across those seasons were extensive and detailed. Peter would perform flatulence directed at Meg's face as a form of entertainment. He would physically push or shove her. He would make explicit statements about wishing she did not exist. The show featured a flashback revealing that Peter and Lois had attempted to leave Meg at a fire station when she was an infant, presenting this as family history that was meant to be funny. The entire family participated, not just Peter. Lois, who had been the patient and caring counterbalance to Peter's recklessness in the early seasons, developed a coolness and contempt toward Meg that contradicted her early characterization almost entirely. Chris began joining in on the cruelty. Even Stewie, who barely interacted with Meg in the original run, started directing casual cutting remarks at her. The household as an entity had unified around a single position. Meg deserved what she got, and what she got was not good. The Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party remains the most discussed piece of Meg-related content in the show's history, and it is discussed primarily because of how it ended. The episode placed the Griffin family in the house during a hurricane, confined together without the usual ability to escape each other. Over the episode's running time, Meg was brought to a point of confrontation. She turned to her family and spoke directly about how they had treated her, and the speech she gave was specific, emotional, and carried the weight of everything that had accumulated over multiple seasons of sustained mistreatment. She called out Peter for the specific things he had done. She called out Lois's inadequacies as a mother. She described in some detail what years of being the target of her own family's contempt had done to her. For a significant portion of the audience that had been watching the Meg storyline develop with increasing discomfort, this felt like the show acknowledging what it had been doing, like accountability was coming. The episode then revealed that in Meg's absence as the family's designated target, the other Griffins began turning their cruelty on each other, and the family started to fall apart. The episode concluded with Meg voluntarily agreeing to resume her role as the person the family directed its frustrations toward. She accepted the role of punching bag because, the episode suggested, her willingness to absorb that role was what allowed the family to function at all. Critics and domestic violence advocates, and a large portion of the fan community, reacted to this ending with genuine anger, directed at a specific and articulable problem. The episode's conclusion told its audience that people who are being mistreated by their families have a responsibility to continue absorbing that mistreatment because their suffering is functionally necessary for the people hurting them. The message was not subtle. Meg explicitly chose to return to being victimized because she understood that her victimization served a structural purpose. The show eventually began pulling back from the most extreme versions of Meg's mistreatment around seasons 14 and 15. The production added more women to the writing staff during this period, and those writers pushed back against the sustained cruelty toward the show's main teenage female character. By the later seasons, Meg was getting storylines where she was competent, resilient, even occasionally tough. She fought back against bullies. She was shown as the most functional person in certain situations. But the damage was already a decade old. For roughly 10 seasons, from the revival through the mid-teens of the show's run, Meg Griffin's primary function was to be a target. She was not a character in those years. She was a repeated punchline about ugliness, unwantedness, and deserved suffering. Mila Kunis spoke publicly about the experience of voicing Meg during this period, describing how people would approach her in real life to perform the dismissive catchphrase that had become associated with Peter's treatment of his daughter. The character's humiliation had become a form of fan interaction with the real woman behind it, a real-world extension of the fictional cruelty that was the character's defining experience. The treatment of Meg Griffin was not just aesthetically questionable. It had real effects on a real person who showed up to work every week to give it voice. Section 5B. The wider world of bans and pulled content. Partial terms of endearment was the most dramatic and complete act of censorship in Family Guy's American broadcast history. But it was far from the only time the show found specific pieces of content being removed, edited, or withheld. The show accumulated a significant body of material that was altered after initial production, pulled from circulation after specific real-world events, or modified before being allowed to air at all. Taken together, these moments form a kind of shadow history of the show, a record of all the things that made it out of the writer's room but didn't make it to the audience in the form they were originally created. Some of the most interesting material in this shadow history involves the show's treatment of Osama bin Laden and the events of the 11th of September 2001. An early episode produced before the attacks contained a cutaway gag in which the character of Stewie Griffin distracted airport security officers by performing an entertaining song while weapons moved through the scanner undetected. At the end of the gag, Stewie made a comment about Osama bin Laden, and there was a brief visual depicting the same airport security diversion being employed by the terrorist leader. This sequence was already in the can when the September 11th attacks occurred. For the initial broadcasts of the episode in the period before the attacks, it was simply a joke about airport security being inadequate. After the attacks, it was something else entirely. When the show returned to Adult Swim in 2003 after its cancellation, this cutaway was not included in the episode. It was quietly excised. In subsequent DVD releases and streaming presentations, different versions of the cut appeared in different regions at different times, with the original version being restored in some formats and the edited version persisting in others. The sequence exists, but its relationship to mainstream availability has been complicated and variable ever since September 2001, turned it from a security joke into something with an entirely different resonance. The Pat Tillman situation produced a similar quiet excision. In the Season 6 episode Stewie Kills Lois, Peter Griffin mentioned Pat Tillman while serving in Afghanistan, a reference that was in the episode as originally produced. Pat Tillman was a professional football player who had given up a lucrative NFL career to enlist in the Army Rangers following September 11th and was killed in action in Afghanistan on the 22nd of April 2004. Subsequent investigation revealed that Tillman had been killed by friendly fire rather than in combat with enemy forces, and that the Army had initially misrepresented the circumstances of his death. He became a complex and emotionally charged figure in American culture, a genuine hero whose death was also a scandal. The reference to him in the Family Guy episode was removed from certain broadcasts and presentations, one of those editorial choices that happens quietly and without announcement, leaving the version of the episode that most contemporary viewers have encountered slightly different from the one that originally aired. The Turban Cowboy situation, discussed at length in Section 7, is the most dramatic example of real-world events causing the removal of an episode from circulation. But it is not the only one. The show has had several other moments where specific content was quietly modified or removed in response to events outside the show's control, rather than as a result of planned editorial decisions. The Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting of the 14th of December 2012 prompted a scheduling change affecting a Family Guy Christmas episode. An episode called Jesus, Mary, and Joseph was scheduled to air on the 16th of December 2012, 2 days after the shooting. Fox chose to replace it with a repeat airing of an older episode, The Christmas content was deemed inappropriate in the immediate aftermath of a school shooting that had killed 20 children. The episode eventually aired the following week, on December 23rd, but the bump reflected a sensitivity to context that the show's production team did not always demonstrate in the content itself. These editorial decisions, made in response to real-world events rather than in anticipation of them, reveal something about the gap between how comedy is created and how comedy is received. A joke is written in a specific moment for an audience that the writers imagine will receive it in a specific context. When that context changes, when something terrible happens in the real world that makes the fictional terrible thing feel different or closer or more charged, the joke doesn't change. The context around it does. Family Guy's production timeline meant that episodes were typically in production for many months before they aired, which created a permanent structural gap between the moment of creation and the moment of broadcast. In that gap, anything could happen, and occasionally, something did. The show's history is marked by moments when the gap was crossed in the wrong direction, when something that was written in one world had to be broadcast into a different one, and the difference was too stark to ignore. Section 6B, The South Park Rivalry and the Manatee Critique. No account of Family Guy's controversies would be complete without addressing the most sustained and articulate creative critique the show received from a peer, which came not from a cultural organization or a government agency or a church group, but from Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park. The relationship between South Park and Family Guy was publicly hostile in ways that generated significant coverage and genuine creative argument. Parker and Stone were explicit about their feelings. They did not respect the show's writing, found its approach to comedy lazy and lacking in craft, and were willing to say so publicly and in their own work. In 2006, South Park aired a two-part episode called Cartoon Wars, in which Cartman embarked on a campaign to get Family Guy canceled. The episodes depicted Family Guy's jokes as being generated by manatees in a large tank who randomly pushed balls marked with individual elements of comedy, a noun, a verb, a celebrity name, a random object into a combination slot, producing jokes that were entirely disconnected from any coherent point of view or structured comedic logic. The implication was that Family Guy's cutaway gags were so random and so uncoupled from anything the show was actually saying that they could be generated by literal animals selecting items from a bin. The episodes were direct and specific in their criticism in a way that was unusual even for South Park, which had always been willing to attack other creative entities. Parker and Stone were not simply saying that Family Guy was less funny than their own show. They were making a structural argument about the nature of the comedy, suggesting that the cutaway gag format as employed by Family Guy did not require creative thought, that any gag could be replaced by any other gag without changing anything about the episode, and that this randomness was not a feature of the show's aesthetic but a symptom of its creative emptiness. After the episodes aired, Parker and Stone reportedly received phone calls from writers on both The Simpsons and King of the Hill thanking them for the critique. This was notable because it suggested that the frustration with Family Guy's approach to comedy extended beyond South Park's specific rivalry and reflected a wider feeling among animated comedy professionals that the show was doing something that undermined certain standards the medium had established. Family Guy responded in various ways over the years, including episodes where characters made dismissive comments about South Park, and the feud became one of the more entertaining ongoing disputes in American animated comedy. But the substance of the South Park critique stuck in a way that less thoughtfully articulated attacks on the show could not, because it identified something specific and real about how the show was changing. The manatee metaphor was remembered because it captured something true about the direction the cutaways were moving. The early cutaway gags of seasons 1 through 3 were genuinely constructed jokes, built around specific connections and specific observations and specific comedic logic. The later cutaway gags increasingly felt like they could have appeared anywhere in any episode, that the connection between the setup line and the gag was loose enough to be essentially interchangeable. You couldn't necessarily swap a cutaway gag from a great South Park episode into another episode and have it work, because South Park's jokes were generally embedded in a specific story. You could often swap a late-period Family Guy cutaway into a different episode of the same show and have it land about as well or as poorly as it did in the episode it originally appeared in. McFarlane addressed the South Park critique publicly and was predictably dismissive of it, questioning the sincerity of the creative concern behind what he saw as a competitive attack. But the critique itself was not refuted. It was deflected, and there is a difference between those two things. The Cartoon Wars episodes also raised a question that went beyond Family Guy specifically. What is comedy for? Is it enough to be funny? Or does comedy have a responsibility to be about something, to be connected to an observation or a point of view that gives the joke meaning beyond its immediate effect? Family Guy, at its best, believed the answer to the second question was yes. At its worst, it behaved as though the first was sufficient. The South Park critique was essentially an argument that the show had gradually stopped asking whether it was about anything and had settled for being funny enough to keep the audience in their seats. The Conway-Twitty phenomenon, which became one of the most discussed examples of the show's later excesses, was the reductio ad absurdum of this drift. Conway-Twitty was a country music singer who died in 1993, and the joke was that the show would occasionally, in place of an actual comedic cutaway, simply air an extended performance of a Conway-Twitty song with no commentary, no punchline, and no connection to anything else in the episode. The first time this happened, it was unexpected enough to be funny through sheer absurdism. By the third or fourth appearance, critics and viewers widely described it as one of the laziest things that had ever appeared on a network television comedy. The show was essentially broadcasting a music video instead of a joke, and the implication was clear enough. The writers didn't have enough material to fill the episode, so they used something that took up time without requiring anyone to be clever. It was the South Park manatee metaphor made literal. The manatees had selected Conway-Twitty from the ball bin and sent it down the combination chute, and nobody in the writer's room had thought to ask whether that constituted a joke. Section 7. B. The political humor that became dated and the fourth wall problem. One of the less discussed but more significant ways in which Family Guy's comedy changed over its long run was in its relationship to current events and topical political humor. The show had always included political references and cultural commentary as part of its comedic vocabulary, and this was not in itself a problem. Comedy with a political dimension can be lasting and powerful. But there is a difference between comedy that uses political material to make a point that transcends the moment and comedy that is so deeply embedded in the specific circumstances of a particular year that it becomes comprehensible only to viewers who lived through that specific moment. As the show extended into its second and third decades of production, it increasingly relied on the second type of political humor. Episodes would be built around specific political figures, specific news cycles, specific cultural controversies that were intensely felt at the time of production and that aged poorly once the moment passed. A joke about a specific politician's specific scandal from 2015 was extremely funny to people watching in 2015 and significantly less comprehensible to anyone watching the episode 5 years later without a detailed memory of the political context that gave it meaning. The 2019 episode Trump Guy, which featured a story set at a Trump resort and included direct interaction with a cartoon version of Donald Trump, generated controversy for multiple reasons, and also illustrated the specific aging problem of topical political content, in particularly clear terms. The episode was deeply embedded in the specific cultural moment of the early Trump presidency in ways that made it a document of that moment rather than a piece of comedy with lasting legs. McFarlane, who had been publicly critical of Trump and of Fox News' coverage of him, used the episode to express those criticisms in a direct and often broad way that felt, to some viewers, more like an editorial than a piece of entertainment. The episode also contained a line that generated its own controversy entirely separate from the Trump-related content. A character stated that the show had been trying to phase out the gay jokes. This single line became the subject of significant coverage across entertainment media, with many publications treating it as a major announcement about the show's creative direction. Critics of the show argued that the gay jokes had not in fact been phased out, that they continued to appear in episodes both before and after the episode in question, and that the self-referential comment was more aspirational than descriptive. The fourth wall problem developed in parallel with the topical humor problem. Breaking the fourth wall, meaning having characters acknowledge that they are fictional characters in a television show and speak directly to the audience, was a structural element of Family Guy from early in the show's run. Used strategically and sparingly, it could be genuinely funny. Used constantly, as the later seasons increasingly employed it, it became something else. Characters would reference the show's declining quality. They would make jokes about Fox. They would directly address the audience to comment on the weakness of a particular storyline or joke. They would meta-commentary on the act of meta-commentary. Peter Griffin would look at the camera and acknowledge that the preceding scene had not been particularly good. Some viewers found this self-awareness refreshing and genuinely funny. A significant segment found it the opposite of reassuring. If the people making a show know it isn't as good as it used to be, and their response is to make jokes about that fact rather than attempting to address it, the audience is not being let in on a clever secret. They are being told that the production has given up on the pretense that improvement is possible and has decided to make their awareness of the decline into the new comedy. A show that is genuinely confident in its work does not need to preemptively make fun of its own failures. A show that acknowledges its failures through humor and then continues making the same failures is not being courageously self-aware. It is using the appearance of self-awareness to avoid the harder work of actually being better. These structural observations about the later seasons were not lost on critics, on fans who had watched from the beginning, or on the cultural conversation around the show. They were part of what made the controversies of the later years feel different from the controversies of the early years, not just in content but in what they revealed about the creative posture of the people making the show. Section 8b. The Stewie Evolution and the Loss of the Evil Genius. One of the most significant changes in Family Guy's character roster over its long run, and one that generated consistent and sustained fan complaint, was the gradual transformation of Stewie Griffin from the show's most original creation into something considerably more familiar and considerably less threatening. In the first 3 seasons, Stewie Griffin was unlike anything else on American television. He was 1 year old, dressed in a yellow shirt and a diaper, and he wanted to take over the world and kill his mother. He spoke with a refined, vaguely British accent that conjured the register of a Hollywood villain from a Golden Age spy film. He built ray guns in his bedroom. He constructed time machines and mind control devices and weather-altering apparatus. He delivered lengthy, elaborate monologues about his plans for global domination while sitting in a high chair eating strained peas. The comedy came from the contrast. Here was this tiny person in the most helpless physical form that human beings occupy, and he was the most dangerous and most intellectually formidable mind in any room he entered. His attempts to kill Lois were a recurring feature of nearly every episode, ranging from elaborate murder schemes involving his various inventions to smaller, more casual expressions of his desire for her elimination. Lois almost never knew. She would pick him up and hug him and coo over him while he plotted her destruction. And the gap between what she thought was happening and what was actually happening was the engine of some of the show's best comedy. MacFarlane and the writing staff made the decision, starting around season 4, that the evil baby concept had been taken as far as it could go. They believed they had explored every angle of Stewie wanting to kill Lois and dominate the world that was available to them, and that continuing to return to those same beats would make the character feel stale. The decision was made to evolve him, to soften him, to develop his emotional life and his relationship with Brian, and to move him away from villainy and towards something more nuanced. This decision is defensible in principle. Characters do need to evolve. A premise that worked brilliantly for 3 seasons is not guaranteed to work brilliantly for 30. The evil baby concept, as purely executed as it was in the early seasons, had a structural limitation. The joke was essentially always the same joke, even when the specifics varied. A baby who talks like a villain and wants world domination and tries to kill his mother will always be funny in roughly the same way, and there is a ceiling on how long that specific funny can last. But the counter-argument is at least as strong. Family Guy went on to produce far more seasons with the evolved Stewie than it ever did with the evil one. If the writers could find enough material to sustain the gentler, more emotionally available, less murderous version of the character for 15 or more seasons, the argument that the evil baby concept had run out of road after 3 doesn't hold up. The concept didn't run out of runway. The writers ran out of specific ideas for it and chose the path that required less creative effort to sustain. What was lost in the transition was specific and irreplaceable. There are hundreds of animated characters who are funny, sidekicks, emotionally complex, and searching for their identity. There is only one evil genius baby with a British accent who builds death rays in his crib and tries to murder his mother between scheduled nap times. The specificity of the original Stewie was the thing that made him stand apart from everything else in animated comedy, and once that specificity was gradually traded away for a more versatile but less original version of the character, something that could not be recovered was gone. The Season 6 two-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie was widely read, both at the time and in retrospect, as the unofficial farewell to the original version of the character. In those episodes, Stewie finally accomplished what he had been working towards since the first episode. He killed Lois. He took over the world. He became the dictator he had always described himself as. It was dramatic, it was darkly funny, and it was the most fully realized version of the evil genius concept the show had ever produced. Then came the twist. It was all a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it had actually happened. The world was reset, and after those episodes, the show never returned to the evil Stewie in any sustained or serious way. The two-parter had been a kind of farewell tour, a chance to see the original character in his full glory one last time before the version that replaced him took permanent hold. Many fans who watched the show from its earliest episodes described the loss of evil Stewie as the single most significant creative compromise in the show's history. Not because the replacement version of the character is terrible, it isn't. It generates its own genuinely good moments, but because what replaced him is the kind of thing that exists everywhere in animated comedy, while what he was had existed nowhere else. Section 12B. The specific weight of 25 years of controversy. Looking at the full catalog of Family Guy's controversies requires holding two things in mind simultaneously, and the difficulty of holding them together is part of what makes the show's history so genuinely complicated to assess. On one hand, the controversies were real, their effects were real, and the damage done in specific instances, to the Meg Griffin character, to the audience's trust after Brian's death, to viewers who experienced the Screams of Silence episode as an inaccurate and potentially harmful depiction of domestic violence, was real damage that affected real people. On the other hand, the conversations those controversies generated were sometimes genuinely valuable. The legal precedents established by the Carol Burnett case and the Bourne Company case have implications for creative freedom that extend well beyond Family Guy. The public argument around partial terms of endearment clarified something real about how broadcast television decides what conversations it is and isn't willing to have. Andrea Faye Friedman's response to Sarah Palin's criticism contributed something substantive to a public argument about disability representation that deserved exactly the kind of intervention someone in her position was uniquely positioned to make. A show that generates only harm through its controversies is doing something different from a show that generates harm and value in varying proportions across different controversies. Family Guy did both. The ratio shifted over time, with the value being more consistently present in the early seasons and the harm more consistently present in the later ones, but neither was ever entirely absent. The specific weight of 25 years of controversy, measured against the specific weight of what Family Guy was at its best, produces a complicated balance that resists easy judgment. People who love the show in its golden years carry with them what it was when it was good, and that memory is not erased by what it became later. People who encountered the show primarily in its later seasons have a different relationship to it, one that may not include the warmth and the craft that made the early controversies feel worth having. The show's longevity is itself a kind of argument, though it is an argument that cuts in multiple directions. A show that has been running for 27 seasons and still has an audience, however diminished, is clearly doing something that some people find worthwhile. But longevity in American television does not automatically confer quality, and the conditions that keep a show on the air after its creative peak has passed have more to do with economics than with artistic merit. Family Guy will continue. The renewal through season 27 makes this certain. More episodes will be produced, more controversies will be generated, more FCC complaints may or may not be filed by organizations that have spent decades filing them without success. The machine will keep running. Whether what comes out of the machine will be worth arguing about is a different question, and one that only time and the specific content of those future seasons can answer. What we know from the history we have is that at its most alive, Family Guy was genuinely worth arguing about. The show's controversies in those years were not the sign of a show failing at something. They were the sign of a show attempting something difficult and sometimes succeeding at it. The comedy that generated real cultural heat in the early seasons was the comedy that was trying to say something true about the world by making you laugh at it. The best argument for Family Guy, after 25 years of everything it went through, is not that it always got it right. It's that it kept trying to get it right in a way that required it to risk getting it wrong. And that risk, when it was genuine rather than calculated, was one of the things that made American animated comedy in the early 21st century something more than entertainment. A show that never controversies, never says anything worth saying. The question is always whether the price of the controversy was worth what was being said. For Family Guy, at its peak, the answer was yes. For the long middle period and the increasingly mechanical later seasons, the answer becomes less certain. But the history is there, all of it. The brilliant and the ugly and the manipulative and the genuinely brave. And it belongs to the show's record in full. That record, controversies and all, is what makes Family Guy worth studying, not despite the arguments it generated, because of them. Section 10. Seth MacFarlane versus Fox. A public feud. There is a particular kind of professional relationship that begins in mutual need and ends in mutual resentment, where both parties have too much invested in the arrangement to leave, but too much frustration with each other to pretend the arrangement is what it used to be. Seth MacFarlane's relationship with Fox, in the latter half of Family Guy's run, had the qualities of exactly this kind of arrangement. And unlike most industry tensions that play out privately, this one happened in full public view. In August of 2021, MacFarlane posted a message directed at Fox that used the language of a failing marriage with unusual specificity. He wrote that Tucker Carlson's latest commentary made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He described the relationship as no longer working, invoking the specific imagery of a marriage where intimacy had mostly ceased, where the families involved didn't get along, and where he had already moved on emotionally to someone else. The someone else, in this metaphor, was NBC, a reference to the $200 million deal he had signed with NBC Universal in January of 2020, which moved his production company away from Fox's corporate ecosystem and into NBC's. This was not a first offense. In June of 2018, MacFarlane had posted a tweet, subsequently deleted, describing himself as embarrassed to work for the company after Tucker Carlson advised his viewers to distrust mainstream news sources and rely instead on Fox's own commentary for their understanding of events. MacFarlane called this fringe content and said it made him ashamed of his corporate affiliation. In April of 2020, during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, MacFarlane responded publicly to Fox News host Laura Ingram's commentary on the public health response by telling her that he genuinely could not fathom that they produced content for the same corporation. The pattern across these incidents was consistent. MacFarlane was publicly expressing a separation of values between himself and the news division of the corporate entity whose entertainment division had made him famous and wealthy. The structural complexity here is real but worth explaining. Fox Broadcasting Company, which airs Family Guy, and Fox News Channel, which airs conservative commentary programming, were formally separated through the 2019 Disney acquisition of much of the Fox entertainment empire. Fox News and Fox Sports remained with the Murdoch family. Fox Broadcasting and the studio that produces Family Guy became part of Disney. So when MacFarlane was criticizing Fox News, he was technically criticizing a company that was no longer his direct employer. But the branding and the shared name made this distinction largely invisible in public perception, and MacFarlane seemed not to find the corporate separation sufficient to address his discomfort with the association. The name was the same, the history was the same, the perception was the same. Family Guy, which had spent years making jokes about Fox News, continued to air on a broadcast network that shared that name, while its creator publicly wished it were anywhere else. The $200 million NBC Universal deal was not a small or symbolic gesture. Reported as worth approximately $40 million per year across 5 years, it covered the development of new projects across NBC's broadcast and streaming properties. MacFarlane met with representatives from Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Warner Brothers, Sony, Disney, and Viacom before signing with NBC Universal, which meant the deal was the result of a genuine competitive process. He was actively and deliberately building his professional future somewhere else. Family Guy continued on Fox because it had to, not because he chose to keep it there. The contracts governing the show's production and broadcast were with Fox and its successors. The show's corporate existence was independent of MacFarlane's creative and institutional affiliations. He could sign deals with NBC and express public frustration with Fox News, but Family Guy was going to keep airing on Fox as long as Fox wanted it to air there, and Fox very much wanted it to air there. In April 2025, The renewal deal announced that the show would continue through its 27th season and the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season would consist of 15 episodes. The show was being locked in for multiple years into the future, guaranteed continued production. MacFarlane, speaking in an interview in 2024, described the show as having reached what he called escape velocity, borrowed from physics, describing the state in which an object moves fast enough to overcome gravity and continue indefinitely. Applied to a television show, it describes a state where the show has been running long enough and generating revenue in enough different forms that there is no compelling economic reason to stop making it, even if the compelling creative reasons have faded. He talked about the show's financial utility, about the causes it helped fund, about its role as a reliable revenue stream. He did not describe exciting creative possibilities he was eager to explore. This is the condition Family Guy occupied in its later years. A product that is still profitable, still recognizable, still capable of generating content that some people find funny, but no longer driven by the passionate creative engagement of its original architect. The controversies it generates in this period are different from the controversies of the early seasons, not because the content is less provocative, but because the provocation feels less purposeful, less connected to a specific point of view that someone cares deeply about advancing. Section 11. Sarah Palin, Down syndrome, and a Valentine's Day controversy. When a show makes a joke that references a real political figure's child with a disability, it is operating in particularly sensitive territory. The joke can be defended on satirical grounds, through the argument that powerful people are legitimate targets of comedy and that their children, when referenced in the context of the parent's public role rather than the child's private life, are not entirely shielded from that satire. These arguments are reasonable in the abstract and have been sustained in legal and cultural debates about the limits of political satire for as long as political satire has existed. They become more complicated when the reaction comes from the parent, and more complicated still when the person who actually performed the character at the center of the controversy pushes back against that parent with more precision and more humor than anyone expected. Family Guy's Valentine's Day 2010 episode, called Extra Large Medium, contained a scene in which Chris Griffin asked out a teenage girl named Ellen who had Down syndrome. The date did not go particularly well, primarily because Ellen turned out to be considerably more assertive and self-possessed than Chris was equipped to handle. At one point, Chris asked about her parents. Ellen told him her father was an accountant and her mother was the former governor of Alaska. The reference was unmistakable. Sarah Palin had served as governor of Alaska before her selection as John McCain's running mate in the 2008 presidential election. Her son Trig, born in 2008, has Down syndrome. The line in the Family Guy episode placed Palin's specific combination of biographical markers into the mouth of a character with Down syndrome, who was portrayed as vivid, capable, and sharp. The joke about Palin was embedded in a context that was actually relatively positive toward the character who made it. Palin reacted through Fox News, which was for the former governor and frequent Fox News contributor a natural venue for cultural responses. She described the episode as deeply hurtful and spoke about what it meant to be the parent of a child with Down syndrome, about the challenges those children face and the ways in which popular culture's treatment of their condition affected their ability to move through the world with dignity. MacFarlane appeared on Larry King Live to discuss the controversy. His position was that the joke had been at Palin's expense, not at the expense of people with Down syndrome generally, and that the episode overall depicted its Down syndrome character positively as a person with agency and wit rather than as someone defined by limitations. He acknowledged that a parent of a child with the condition could reasonably have feelings about comedy involving it, and he was more measured in this response than he typically was when discussing objections to the show. Then Andrea Faye Friedman entered the conversation, and the dynamic shifted. Friedman, who has Down syndrome, was the actress who had voiced Ellen in the episode. She had been working as an actress for approximately 18 years at that point, appearing in shows including Life Goes On, ER, and Seventh Heaven, among others. She sent a response to the New York Times that became one of the more widely quoted pieces of commentary generated by any Family Guy controversy in the show's history. She told the Times that she thought the former governor did not have a sense of humor. She said the line about being the daughter of the former governor of Alaska was funny to her, and that the word for what the joke was doing was sarcasm. She said her family believed laughing was good and that her parents had raised her to have a sense of humor and to live a normal life. Then she added, addressing Palin's habit of bringing Trig to political events and campaign appearances. Her mother did not carry her around under her arm like a loaf of French bread, the way former Governor Palin carries her son Trig around looking for sympathy and votes. The loaf of French bread image traveled far and fast. It was precise, it was funny, it was delivered by someone whose authority to comment on the subject was not available to anyone else in the conversation, and it reframed the entire controversy. The actress with Down syndrome, who had actually been in the episode, had looked at the parent of a child with Down syndrome who was outraged about the episode, and found the parent's response to be more condescending toward her and people like her than anything in the episode itself. Palin did not publicly respond to Friedman's statement in any significant way. The extra-large medium controversy sits in an interesting space in Family Guy's history because it is one of the cases where the controversy produced something genuinely interesting. A public argument about the representation of disability in comedy that was more nuanced and substantive than most arguments the show generated. Friedman's response raised real questions about who has the authority to determine how disability is represented, what it means for a parent to speak in public on behalf of a disabled child, and whether discomfort with comedy involving disability is itself sometimes a form of condescension toward disabled people rather than a defense of them. These are questions that don't have clean answers. The fact that a Family Guy controversy generated them is, in its own modest way, evidence that the show was sometimes doing something with more substance than simply being offensive. Section 12. The long catalog. Smaller controversies that accumulated. Beyond the major landmarks, there is a long catalog of smaller incidents and individual episodes that each contributed to Family Guy's running reputation as the most inflammatory animated program on American television. These are worth walking through, because the accumulation of smaller controversies is as revealing as any single major event. The episode The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire, from Season 4, contained a cutaway gag in which Peter Griffin and a barbershop quartet appeared at the bedside of a man dying from AIDS. They sang and danced around his deathbed in a way clearly intended as comedic. AIDS advocacy and service organizations reacted immediately, condemning the scene as irresponsible and disturbing. The criticism was specific. At a time when AIDS continued to affect enormous numbers of people and stigma around the disease remained significant, using a person dying from AIDS as the setup for a music number was offensive in a way that was difficult to defend through the usual satire arguments. The show presented no satirical frame for the gag. It was not mocking people who found AIDS funny. It was simply finding a dying AIDS patient funny. The response from advocacy groups was organized and vocal, but the episode aired, remained in reruns, and the controversy moved on as Family Guy controversies always did. Season 7 produced the episode 420, which followed Brian Griffin's campaign to legalize marijuana. The episode's domestic reception was relatively contained, but internationally it prompted Venezuela's government to respond. The Justice Minister issued an official statement condemning the episode as American propaganda promoting drug use, and cable networks in the country were warned that continuing to air Family Guy could result in financial penalties. An American animated comedy was effectively banned from Venezuelan television by government decree. This was not a FCC complaint. This was not a lawsuit. This was a foreign government's official enforcement action against a cartoon, and it demonstrated that the show's reach and its capacity to generate reactions extended beyond the borders of the country that made it. The episode Family Gay, discussed earlier in the context of the 188,000 FCC complaints, also drew specific criticism from the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation and from LGBTQ commentators who argued that the episode's premise, that homosexuality could be pharmacologically induced and would wear off when the induced substance metabolized, reinforced harmful ideas about the nature of sexual orientation, even when the episode's framing was nominally pro-acceptance. The show had constructed an episode that argued, in story terms, for accepting gay people while simultaneously depicting gayness as a temporary condition that could be chemically produced and reversed. Critics noted the contradiction, though the show and its defenders maintained that the comedic context insulated the episode from being read as a serious statement about biology. An episode called Quagmire's Dad, from Season 8, introduced a transgender character named Ida Davis, Quagmire's parent, who had transitioned from a man named Dan. The episode's treatment of Ida was complicated. MacFarlane described her as portrayed with sympathy and dignity, and in some respects the character was depicted positively, as someone comfortable and confident in her identity, but the episode also contained a sequence where Brian Griffin, who had unknowingly been romantically interested in Ida, reacted to discovering she was transgender by vomiting in an extended comedic scene. Glad described this as shockingly insensitive, and noted that the vomit reaction reinforced a harmful cultural trope regardless of any positive elements elsewhere in the episode. MacFarlane defended the portrayal, while Glad maintained that the sympathetic elements were undercut by the specific comic choices around Brian's reaction. Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, which aired in October of 2011, generated its own distinct controversy. The episode concerned Quagmire's sister in an abusive relationship and was unusual for Family Guy in treating its subject with almost no comedy. The domestic violence depicted in the episode was portrayed seriously and graphically, and critics and domestic violence advocates objected to multiple aspects of how the episode handled the subject, particularly its simplistic and inaccurate portrayal of why victims stay in abusive relationships and its suggestion that murdering the abuser was the appropriate resolution. What made this controversy particularly notable was what came after it. In 2014, a director's cut of the episode was released with significant revisions to how the abuser's behavior was depicted. The original episode had shown the abuser as openly, publicly violent in ways that domestic violence advocates argued was inaccurate and potentially harmful. The revised version made the abuse more subtle and private, closer to how abusive behavior actually functions in real relationships. This was the most explicit acknowledgement in the show's history that a specific creative choice had been wrong enough to warrant revisiting. The recasting of Cleveland Brown in 2020 completed the most significant character-level controversy in the show's later period. Mike Henry, who is white, had voiced the black character Cleveland Brown since the show's very first episode in 1999. He had continued voicing Cleveland through that character's own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. In June 2020, in the context of a broader cultural moment around representation in animation, Henry announced that he would be stepping down from the role. MacFarlane supported the decision publicly. The announcement was received mostly positively, as an acknowledgement that a casting practice which had been standard in animation for decades was no longer appropriate. Section 13. What the controversies actually meant. Standing at some distance from all of it, from the 188,000 FCC complaints and the federal lawsuits and the Venezuelan government ban and the episode that never aired in America and the death and resurrection of the talking dog and a decade of sustained cruelty toward a teenage girl and a creator who publicly described wanting his show on any other network, the question that presents itself is what any of this meant in aggregate. The FCC complaints failed in every legal and regulatory sense. The agency denied them repeatedly, consistently, and on principled grounds that reflected an accurate reading of the applicable law. Family Guy never faced a fine. No episode was pulled from broadcast as a result of FCC action. The Parents Television Council's sustained campaign of organized complaint produced no enforcement outcome whatsoever, despite generating numbers of formal government filings that would have been extraordinary for almost any other type of regulatory action. The machinery of federal broadcast regulation was applied to Family Guy and found the show's content legally permissible across more than 2 decades of continuous operation. The lawsuits failed too. Carol Burnett sued and lost. The Bourne Company sued and lost. The First Amendment and the doctrine of parody proved to be robust enough protections that animated comedy, operating in the register of satire, was essentially immune to the legal tools that offended parties brought to bear against it. These failures are actually important, because they established a precedent about the latitude available to transgressive comedy in American broadcast television that extends well beyond Family Guy specifically. The show served in part as a legal and regulatory test case for what animated comedy was allowed to do, and the results of that test were expansive. The zone of protected speech is very wide. The tools available to those who want to constrain it are very limited. The Venezuelan ban was real but had no practical impact on the show's operation in its primary market. Being banned in Venezuela was an inconvenience for Venezuelan viewers who wanted to watch Family Guy, not for Fox or for the show's production. The Brian Griffin death and resurrection did produce one concrete and measurable outcome. It damaged the show's relationship with a specific portion of its most devoted audience in a way that was not fully repaired. The Twitter outrage and the Change.org petition and the national media coverage all subsided. But the segment of the audience that felt they had been manipulated carried that experience with them, and it changed how they related to subsequent episodes. A show that has demonstrated it will use your emotional investment as fuel for a promotional stunt has told you something true about itself, and once you know it, you cannot unknow it. The Meg Griffin controversy produced, eventually, a practical result. More women joined the writing staff. Those writers pushed back against the most extreme versions of the storyline, and the character was treated with more basic humanity in the later seasons. This is a real improvement, achieved slowly and incompletely, but real. The sustained public criticism of the Meg storyline over many years contributed to the conditions that made the improvement possible. The partial terms of endearment situation produced no change in Fox's policy, no alteration of the episode, and no domestic broadcast. It remains the most complete act of censorship in the show's history. The thing it censored was, by the standards of Family Guy's overall content, one of the more thoughtful and restrained pieces of writing the show produced. The Sarah Palin controversy produced a memorable public exchange and then dissipated, but it left behind Andrea Faye Friedman's response, which became one of the more quoted pieces of text associated with any Family Guy controversy, and the argument it made resonated in ways that extended beyond the immediate dispute about one episode. Seth MacFarlane's public feud with Fox produced no immediate change in the show's broadcast home. Family Guy continued to air on Fox and will continue to do so through at least the 2028 to 2029 television season. But MacFarlane's public statements established something genuinely unusual, a record of a creator's genuine estrangement from the corporate context in which his most famous creation continued to exist long after his original creative passion had relocated to other projects. What the controversies collectively revealed is something that was always true about Family Guy. That may be the deepest truth about what the show actually was. It was designed to generate argument. Not in the sense that controversy was an accident or a side effect. In the sense that controversy was the product. The show was an argument machine. It generated disagreements about what comedy is allowed to do, what speech is protected, what responsibility a popular entertainment has toward its audience. Those arguments had value. Some of them produced real insights. Some of them changed things. The controversies were not accidental. They were structural. They were built into the show's identity from the beginning, and they served a purpose that went beyond generating outrage for its own sake. They kept the show visible. They kept people arguing about it. They ensured that Family Guy was never just background entertainment. It was always, even at its worst, something you had to have an opinion about. Whether that was worth all the specific damage it did along the way is a question that everyone who cares about the show has to answer for themselves. The banned episodes, the sustained cruelty toward Meg, the exploitation of Brian's death, the careless handling of real-world tragedies, the manipulation of the audience's emotional investment in a 14-year-old character, these were real costs, paid mostly by people who had genuinely loved what the show was in its better moments. The FCC never successfully sanctioned Family Guy for any of its content. Carol Burnett lost her lawsuit. The Parents Television Council filed hundreds of complaints and never succeeded in getting a single episode pulled from broadcast. Venezuela banned it, and the show kept running for another decade and more. Brian Griffin died and came back to life. Meg is still there. Seth MacFarlane is still recording voiceovers for characters he created a quarter of a century ago. The show is still there too, renewed through its 27th season. Still airing, still making jokes that some percentage of its audience will find offensive, and another percentage will find brilliant. The controversies will continue, because the show's entire identity requires them to. A version of Family Guy that never upset anyone would not be Family Guy at all. Family Guy at its best, in those first 3 seasons before the cancellations and the restaffings and the drift and the exploitation, was something genuinely original. It was a show that said uncomfortable things because it believed those uncomfortable things were worth saying, that comedy was a way of seeing the world more clearly, and that discomfort was the price of that clarity. The controversies of those years were worth having, because the thing generating them was worth defending. The controversies of the later years are harder to defend, not because controversy is inherently bad, but because those controversies were generated by a show that had lost its original sense of why it was doing what it was doing. A show can be outrageous and still mean something. The real question Family Guy never fully resolved was whether meaning something and being outrageous were the same project, or whether at some point they started pulling in opposite directions, and the show chose the direction that was easier. The history of the show's Controversies is the history of a creative enterprise that was, at its peak, genuinely worth arguing about, and that spent its subsequent decades arguing about things that were increasingly less worth the argument. The arguments continued regardless, because Family Guy had built an identity that required them, and identities are harder to change than creative visions. The show was never going to become something quiet and inoffensive. That was never an option after the first episode. The real question, looking at everything it went through, was whether it was going to keep finding new things to say with its outrage, or whether the outrage itself was going to become the point rather than the tool. The answer varied, season by season, episode by episode, controversy by controversy, which is probably the most honest thing you can say about a show that ran for 27 seasons and generated enough genuine heat to fill a book many times over. It was never simple. It was never safe. And whatever else it was never boring. That is the story of Family Guy's most insane controversies. From the first government complaints in the year 2000 to the legal battles and international bans and audience betrayals and creator feuds that defined the decades that followed. The show is still running. The controversies are still happening. And somewhere out there, someone is watching an episode that will generate the next argument about what television is allowed to do. If this video kept you company tonight, we would genuinely love to know where you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It is the most direct way to support this channel and make sure more videos like this one get made. Thank you for being here. Sleep well. If you found value in this video, or if it helped you wind down and relax at the end of a long day, that is exactly what we made it for. The story of Family Guy's Controversies is a long one, longer than almost any other animated comedy in American television history, and we hope walking through it together made for good company. The show is still going. The story isn't over. And when new chapters of it arrive, we will be here to trace them with the same care and attention that we brought to everything you just heard. Until next time, Appendix, the show's relationship with its own history. There is one more thing worth noting about Family Guy's long controversy history, and it is the way the show itself has related to that history over time. In the early seasons, the show's provocations were made from a position of genuine creative intention. When the show made a controversial joke, it was making it because someone in the room thought the joke was worth making, that the thing being said through the medium of the joke was worth the discomfort of saying it. There was a directional quality to the controversy, a sense that the show knew where it was going and was choosing to go there. As the seasons accumulated, something changed about this dynamic. The show began making references to its own controversies, to its own history of upsetting people, in ways that suggested the controversy had become self-referential. Characters would mention that the show had been the subject of complaints, or that certain content had upset certain groups, or that the creators were aware of the criticism and unbothered by it. These moments of self-referential controversy, commentary replaced the original kind of controversy, the kind that came from saying something you genuinely believed needed to be said, with a meta-commentary about having said things in the past. This is a subtle but real distinction. A show that is making controversial choices because it believes those choices are creatively necessary is doing something different from a show that is performing the identity of a controversial show without the underlying creative conviction that gave that identity its original meaning. The second version of transgression is essentially theatrical, a kind of cosplay of the first version, and audiences who have been watching long enough tend to be able to tell the difference. The best moments in Family Guy's controversy history were the moments when the show didn't seem to care about being controversial as an end in itself. When it made a joke that it knew would upset people not because upsetting people was the goal, but because the joke was saying something that was worth saying. The worst moments were the ones where the upset was the goal, where the calculation was simply about what would generate the strongest reaction rather than about what was true or funny or insightful. The show at its peak understood the difference. The show in its later years often forgot it. Family Guy made it to 27 seasons. It generated more formal government complaints than almost any other program in the history of American broadcast television. It was sued by one of the most beloved entertainers of the 20th century. It was banned from Venezuelan television. It killed and resurrected one of its most beloved characters in a move that felt to millions of viewers like a betrayal. It spent a decade treating one of its main characters as a punching bag. Its creator publicly described wanting it on any other network than the one it aired on. And through all of that, somehow, it kept going. The show's survival is its own kind of controversy. In a landscape where shows with better recent ratings have been canceled without ceremony, Family Guy has continued to exist, year after year, season after season, renewed again and again by forces that have more to do with economics than with creative merit. The show is too profitable to die, too embedded in the syndication and streaming ecosystem to be easily removed, too recognizable as a brand to be abandoned. Whether that is a triumph or a tragedy depends on what you think of the show. And what you think of the show probably depends on which version of it you encountered first. If you found it in Season 2 or Season 3, when the Griffin family still felt like a family and the jokes still felt like they were being made by people who cared about making them, you have a relationship with it that all the later seasons can't entirely erase. The early show is still there in those first 3 seasons, exactly as it was, sharp and warm and genuinely funny, and no amount of later controversy can take that version of it away. If you found it in Season 10 or Season 15, when the best years were already well behind it and the controversies had become more mechanical than meaningful, you have a different relationship with it, one that doesn't include the full weight of what the show was at its best. Both relationships are valid, both are real, and both tell you something true about Family Guy, which is that it was never one thing across its long and strange and deeply controversial life. It was the show that succeeded against every reasonable expectation, that came back from cancellation when no one thought it would, that made people angry enough to file federal complaints, that made people sad enough to sign petitions about a cartoon dog, that made people uncomfortable in ways that sometimes forced genuinely important conversations about comedy and culture and what television is allowed to do. It was, and it remains, Family Guy. And you either understand why that means something or you don't, and the history of all its controversies is essentially an argument conducted across 25 years and thousands of episodes and hundreds of complaints and several federal court cases about exactly which camp you're in.